Hello Year 10, it's Mr. Godman here and I'm going to be teaching your history lesson today. And in this lesson we're going to look at how Stalin reacted to Truman's policy of containment. Now as always, I'd like you to get yourself ready for the lesson. You'll need your history workbook, a pen, you might need some scrap paper, and I'd like you to put all distractions away such as mobile phones. Pause now, when you're ready, hit play. So it's time for your do now, and this is activity 3.1 in your workbook. Last lesson we looked at the consequences of the Marshall Plan, so you have 5 recall questions to have a go at here. As always, I'd like you to do them without looking back at your notes and without looking at your knowledge organisers, because we're trying to improve your memory. Pause now and do them, and when you're complete, press play again. And here are the answers. I wonder if you remembered for question 3 that Stalin stopped all satellite states, such as Czechoslovakia, from accepting any Marshall Plan aid. Pause now, and as usual, I want you to mark your answers. If you get one wrong, just correct it. If possible, can you do this in a different colour pen? And don't forget to add up your score out of 5 at the end. When you're done, hit play and we'll move forward. So today's lesson is called How Did Stalin React to Truman's Policy of Containment? And in this lesson, I'd like you to find out a little more about how Stalin set up Cominform and Comecon. We're going to learn about the key features of Cominform and Comecon, and we'll look at the consequences. As usual, I'll ask you to update your knowledge organiser now, and we're still working on theme 2, the development of the Cold War. We're going to see 2 events in today's lesson from our timeline, so I'd like you to highlight event number 16 and event number 19. So here's your starter, activity 3.2 in your workbook. Today, I've given you an American political cartoon from 1947, and it's all about Stalin's reaction to the Marshall Plan. What do you think the cartoon means? I want you to pause now and look really carefully at the cartoon. What can you see happening, and what do you think it means? Write down your ideas, and when you're ready, hit play, and we'll move forward. So this was a really interesting cartoon. Let's look at some good answers to that question. Firstly, I'm sure you noticed the basketball here, aimed at the basket. This represents the Marshall Plan, and remember, the Marshall Plan was a key part of Truman's strategy of containment. Now, it's heading straight at the hoop, about to score, and the hoop has the words European recovery around it. This represents the fact that the Marshall Plan was aimed at helping the economies of Europe to recover. And it looks like it's going to succeed. But down here we have Stalin, and look at what he's doing. He's on the opposing team, and he's got his hands in the air trying to intercept the ball. This suggests that he is trying to block the Marshall Plan from succeeding. Stalin tried to stop the Marshall Plan from succeeding by undermining it through 2 organisations, Cominform and Comecon, both of which we'll look at today. I'd like you to pause now and write down an idea which you missed. And when you've done that, hit play again. Now it's time to introduce some new knowledge. Here's our big picture, and today we're going to look at two events. We're going to jump about a little bit in terms of time frame as well. We're going to look at the creation of Cominform in 1947 and the creation of Comecon in 1949. So as we've seen in the last couple of lessons, Truman adopted a policy of containment in his Truman Doctrine, and he developed it further in the Marshall Plan, providing financial aid to European countries who were at risk of turning communist. In American eyes, these were both defensive moves designed to stop the USSR from spreading communism and to contain it. But in Soviet eyes, these moves seemed very aggressive. The Soviet Union believed that the USA was seeking to dominate Europe and undermine Soviet control of the satellite states. And remember, those satellite states were incredibly important to the Soviet Union. They were a vital buffer zone to protect the USSR from any invasions. So any move by the USA which undermined Soviet control of those satellite states was seen as a threat. And so Stalin reacted by creating two organizations to counter Truman's policies. They were called Cominform and Comecon, and we'll look at both of them. First, let's look at Cominform, or the Communist Information Bureau, which was set up by Stalin in 1947. Now, there were several reasons why Stalin did this. Firstly, he was reacting to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, both of which were increasing American influence in Europe. Stalin saw this as a challenge and threat to the Soviet Union. Secondly, don't forget, at this time, the USSR was busy setting up satellite states with communist governments in Eastern Europe and wanted to tighten Soviet control of them. But in addition to this, Stalin wanted to coordinate the activities of communists in all European countries, even those in Western Europe, making sure that they acted under Soviet direction. So what did Cominform actually do? Firstly, Cominform was used to try and disrupt the Marshall Plan. Communist parties in Western Europe, including those in Italy and France, were instructed to organize strikes and even damage property to hinder the economic recovery. Cominform also ensured that all communist governments followed the same vision of communism. It did this by instructing communist parties in satellite states to follow Soviet policies. It also produced propaganda. For example, it published an international communist newspaper. This encouraged all communist states to apply the same consistent communist policies. Stalin's creation of Cominform had two significant consequences. Firstly, it increased rivalry with the USA, which saw Cominform as an attempt to undermine the economies of Western Europe and spread communist ideology there. Secondly, Cominform was used to increase the amount of propaganda produced by the communist side. They typically depicted the capitalist powers as hostile and aggressive. In response to this, the capitalist powers increased their use of propaganda too, depicting communism as a menace to free countries everywhere. So both sides increased their use of coordinated propaganda. Now let's look at Comecon, which Stalin set up 2 years later in 1949. Why did he do it? Well, by this time, the Marshall Plan was beginning to raise living standards in Western Europe. And some of the satellite states were tempted to apply for American aid too. Stalin could not allow this. He wanted to stop the satellite states falling under US influence by organizing an alternative to the Marshall Plan for communist countries. So what were the key features of Comecon? Well, it was an economic council for communist countries, and it was based in Moscow in the Soviet Union. That meant that it was firmly under Soviet control. And Comecon was responsible for planning and coordinating industries and resources across the communist countries. And each communist country was encouraged to focus on a specialism. For example, the satellite state Bulgaria specialized in electronics. Now, the creation of Comecon had some important consequences. Firstly, it increased the Soviet Union's control over its satellite states. Now, the Soviet Union controlled their economies too. Secondly, it resulted in a reduction of trade between the satellite states and Western Europe. Satellite states were discouraged from trading with countries in the West. In fact, they were discouraged from having any kinds of links with Western European countries. And thirdly, a gap in living standards began to appear between Western and Eastern Europe. Countries in the West which received Marshall aid found that their economies began to recover and grow quickly, whereas countries in the East, who were members of Comecon, found that their economies stagnated. That meant their economies didn't grow very much, didn't produce much wealth. So by the 1950s, people in Western Europe were enjoying a much better standard of living than people in Eastern Europe. And now you're ready for your main task. This is activity 3.3 in your workbook. As always, you need to do your reading carefully first. Then you have a couple of key terms that I'd like you to define in your own words. Finally, I want you to complete this table comparing Cominform and Comecon. I want you to record when they were set up, what their key roles were, and what consequences they had. Well done in today's lesson. If you want to take this a little further, you could do some research of your own into the Marshall Plan. Have a look on the internet and see if you can find a propaganda cartoon that comes from a Western perspective. You can see some examples here. I'd like you to try and find one, label the cartoon, and see if you can explain what the message of the cartoon is. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get to know when new videos are published. And remember, there are plenty more Cold War videos on the channel for you to develop your knowledge further.